I hope it's visible.
You want to put it as a big screen? I mean, like
Yeah,
a
sure.
full screen? Okay, great.
It's
So
fine
let me
now.
just let me introduce you and then you can start. So everyone, welcome to this edition of IPN. This Saturday we're having Ashitha MS, who's going to talk about mind, supervenience, and autonomous mental dysfunctions, a critical analysis. She's a research scholar at the Department of Philosophy, University of Hyderabad. So yeah, you can start whenever you're ready.
Yeah. Thank you. Um, my discussion today is on mind supervenience and autonomous mental dysfunction, a critical analysis. Um, Before going into the discussion, I would like to have a very short note on the terminology autonomous mental dysfunction. So I want to clarify where this notion comes from, what is the background of it. So this idea of autonomous mental dysfunction is associated with um, a debate on whether mental disorders are brain disorders. So there are a group of thinkers, both philosophers of psychiatry and psychiatrists and neuropsychiatrists, who deny that mental disorders are brain disorders. Although they vary in their reasons, the common thread of all their arguments is that mental disorders are not brain disorders. And they claim that mental disorders constitute an autonomous, distinct category of their own. And that is where the notion autonomous mental dysfunction comes. So it simply means that mental dysfunctions that are not reducible to brain dysfunctions. So this idea of autonomous dysfunctions comes as part of this question: are mental disorders brain disorders? Which is still a contentious issue. So there are like two contrasting answers to this question. There is one model that argue that mental disorders are necessarily brain disorders because mind is nothing but the brain and its functions. There is no mind without a brain. The for all mental events are brain events. I mean, all mental states are realized by a brain state. Therefore, all mental disorders must be brain disorders. However, there is an opposite view which denies that mental disorders are necessarily brain disorders. So, this argument is collectively called the argument for the autonomy of mental disorders, though the proponents of this view is not calling their argument by this name. In literature, it is referred by this term of the argument for autonomy of mental disorders. So I'll be focusing on this argument um, and how they are making the claim that mental disorders are not necessarily implying that there is a disordered brain underneath. So before going into that, the brain disease model is actually claiming that the necessity of mental disorder being a brain disorder comes from the fact that all mental processes are brain processes. So the brain is the organ of the mind, where else would be mental illness if not in the brain. This is from Eric Kandel, who is a Nobel Prize winning neuroscientist. And we can see a similar articulation in Nancy Andreassen's work, The Broken Brain. She argues that people who suffer from mental illness suffer also from a sick or broken brain. So all these uh, um, brain disorders here, as depicted in the brain disease model, is referring to some dysfunction in the neural circuits, not any lesions or part of the brain that got damaged due to any trauma, like a physical trauma, but it is dysfunctional brain circuits. It could be either hyper or hypoactivation of neural circuits, or maybe the imbalances in neuro transmitters. So this is what underlies the research domain criteria, which is a framework for researchers in mental disorder, and like the scientific research in mental disorders has a new framework called the research domain criteria, which is introduced by NIMH in US, National Institute of Mental Health in the US. So the research domain criteria is also preoccupied with the idea that we can, at least in the future, we can find out the brain pathology underlying mental disorders. And they are also emphasizing on finding out the neural circuitry that is uh, pathologized in the case of various mental disorders. So there is like a tremendous amount of hope for this identifying of brain pathology of mental disorders. However, there is arguments against this brain disease model, and majorly these arguments comes from two notions. One is the notion of multiple realizability, which states that a same mental state could be realized by multiple brain states. Hence, we cannot reduce or identify a mental disorder with a brain disorder, because in various persons, the same mental state would be realized by various neural circuits, and there is no possibility of an identity that can be established between a particular mental disorder and a particular brain or a neural circuitry that underlies it. Another argument against brain disease model comes from an analogy between mental dysfunctions and software dysfunctions, or software malfunctions. So they are drawing an analogy between mind and software in such a way that um, okay.
Ashita, a quick
Yeah,
clarification.
yeah,
Can you go back to the previous slide?
yeah,
About the multiple realizability, can it be
yeah.
the other way around as well? Like, say, the same mental state could be realized by multiple brain states. Could the reverse be possible, where the same brain state could be giving rise to multiple mental states?
Um, yes, that also is possible. Um, and here I'm talking about the multiple realizability of the same mental state by various, like, different um, brain states, is because in the coming slides I'll be
Sure, sure,
explaining
sure. I just thought
what.
of
Yeah, yeah,
clarifying. Yeah,
yeah,
thank you. Thank you.
yeah. So the analogy argument states that mind is like a software running in a hardware, such that every mental state or a process in the mental realm is also a state or process happening in the brain, just as a software state is also a hardware state. We cannot run a software program without a hardware, and for every function of the software to carry out, there should be some hardware even that is happening behind it. However, the proponents of AAMD refers to the argument for autonomy of mental disorder. So I would be using the short form in the presentation. So the proponents of AAMD claims that although all software states are also a hardware state, it doesn't mean that a software malfunction is also a hardware malfunction. So they give this example that, let us suppose in a computer, the function of double spacing is not working, or when we try to align a document, it shows some message like this is not responding. In such a case, looking at the hardware would be of no use, like opening the keyboard or the desk, like the monitor of the computer would be of no use, and we cannot find what is going wrong. Rather, the problem lies with the software. So we have to intervene on the software to fix this issue. So, in the same way, even if a mental ability or a faculty is not functioning properly, this does not mean that the brain is not functioning properly. So it also imply that a mental disorder can occur in a non-dysfunctional brain. So here, before moving forward, we have to make clear what is the account of dysfunction that they are using here. So we know that we can characterize disorder or dysfunction in a variety of ways. For example, there are naturalist accounts of disorder which would conceptualize disorder as a deviation from the natural, like what we call the normal uh, state of the body or an organ. Or there are normativist conceptions of disorder which will focus on certain norms that are uh, like not met by what we consider as disorder or dysfunctional. Let's say some conditions are harmful to the person, therefore it is considered as disordered. So what is the notion of dysfunction that they use in this particular argument, which uses the computer analogy argument? So most of the proponents of this argument is maintaining a natural dysfunction analysis of disorder, according to which a natural function of an item X, the item X could be an organ system, or a biological process, or a mechanism. So the natural function of X in an organism O is to do the items of X type did to contribute to the exclusive fitness of ancestors, and which caused the genotype to be selected by natural selection. So it simply is the idea that function of an item is the effect for which it was selected naturally through the process of natural selection. So it is actually looking at the evolutionary history of certain functions or certain processes, and if it was selected because of it helped the ancestors to survive and reproduce, then it was carried over to generation, and that is the function the organ or the mechanism is supposed to perform. And if the item X is unable to perform its function adequately, then it constitutes a natural dysfunction. And they consider that medical disorders are natural dysfunctions of this sort. Yeah. So I'll give you an example to make it clear. The failure to pump blood by a heart constitute a dysfunction because pumping blood was a natural function of heart for which it was selected. However, we human beings are not able to fight because our arms are not made in that way. Yet, this does not constitute a dysfunction of the hand because our hands were not selected for the purpose of flying. It does not have the function of flying, nor does any of our body parts. So it must constitute or it must satisfy two conditions to call something dysfunction. Organ must instantiate the condition where the process is not functioning properly, and the function that we are considering must be a natural function of X. Now, we are moving to an argument by Harriet Fagerberg, who tried to refute the computer analogy argument. So she first formulated this conditions for having an autonomous dysfunction for for an entity E by saying that the not E, which is a dysfunctional state, must be instantiated by the organ, and E must be a function of the entity that we are considering. So here how she uses this criteria to refute the autonomous mental dysfunction, the possibility of autonomous mental dysfunction is that for there to be an autonomous mental dysfunction, it must be the case that there must be an organ that instantiates functional mental state, and for anyone who accept physicalism, the organ would be brain. And the process that is dysfunctional in the question, here it is denoted by the letter E. E must be a dysfunction of mind, which is the supervenient property. As per supervenience, mind is supervening on brain. So for the supervenient property of mind to have an autonomous dysfunction, the process or the function that is not performed well in the case of a dysfunctional state must be a function of mind, not of the brain. However, this is not achievable by mind. So she refutes the computer analogy, saying that the autonomous mental dysfunction is not possible in a way autonomous software malfunctions are possible. So the reason for software to have malfunctions in the absence of hardware malfunction is the functional separability, which is the idea that so when designing a software or writing a software program and designing a hardware, they both are assigned different distinct function. Like as we have said earlier, the double spacing or aligning a document is the function assigned just to software, although it is run using a hardware. It is not a function of the hardware. So it is possible for software to have a malfunction even when the hardware is functioning perfectly well. However, this cannot be achieved in the case of mind and brain, because mind and brain are not functionally separable. Because the selection process of functions of mind is nothing but the selection process of brain states which realize the mental process. So in Fagerberg's paper, she writes, the only way in which a natural mental function can be configured into the mind through phylogenetic evolution is by being causally efficacious in the selection of the implementing organ, that is the brain. So to say that this particular mental state has this function is to say that whatever brain state or the neural circuitry which made it possible this particular mental process have this function. Without that brain state being performed, this mental state would not arise. And this would invite this objection, an obvious objection that all of our mental functions or psychological capabilities that we now have are not selected through evolution. For example, we have dyslexia as a learning disorder, disability to read and write. However, this ability is not a dysfunctional state um, of a function that was selected evolutionarily through the natural selection, because we started reading and writing much later. But Fagerberg would argue that this is not just for evolutionarily selected functions, but it also applies to ontogenic functions, which are the functions that we acquire through like throughout the lifespan of the organism. So the inability to write constitute a dysfunction because our brain is through learning, our brain has this function of identifying and reading words. So the inability to do that constitute a dysfunction. So far we have seen that, as Fagerberg noted, there is a crucial disanalogy between software and mind. The selective design of software and hardware assigns separate functions for both of these, and hence a software malfunction does not imply a hardware malfunction. However, the natural selection of mental dysfunction, whether it be through evolution or through ontogenic selection, it is nothing but brain function. There is no selection of mental functions without the selection of the brain function which realizes it. Now I enter into the question, does the disanalogy refute autonomy of mental disorders? So I have noticed that autonomy as implied by the computer analogy argument varies substantially from autonomy as characterized by the proponents of AMD. That means, although the proponents of AMD are using computer analogy in a very hasty way, um, which led to a lot of misconceptions and invited a lot of objection, the autonomy that they actually want to defend is different from what is implied by the analogy argument. To show that I'm going to look at what the proponents of AMD actually tried to defend. So Wakefield, who is one of the like primary or earliest to use the computer analogy, says that okay, he says that every occurrence of mental state is an occurrence of a physical brain state. And in a locational sense, it is true that every mental disorder is a brain disorder. However, it does not imply that every mental disorder is a biological disorder in the stricter sense that there is a physiologically specifiable dysfunction. According to Wakefield, such an inference would seem to be invalid due to the possibility of emergent functions and dysfunctions describable at the mental level of organization that do not correspond to functions and dysfunctions describable in purely non-psychological biological terms. So here I want all of you to notice this notion: functions and dysfunctions describable in purely non-psychological biological terms. The impossibility to explain mental disorders or dysfunctions in purely non-psychological, biological terms is what Wakefield is trying to push. Similarly, Natalia F. Banner was another person who argued that mental disorders are not necessarily brain disorder. Um, she says that many of the key features of psychiatric disorders can only be characterized and understood using the language of mental realm. However, she is not denying that it is very likely to be to have a neurobiological basis to behavior, whether it be dysfunctional or functional. So none of them are denying that every mental process have a neurobiological basis to it, or a realizer in the brain. However, they emphasize that the key features of mental disorders can be characterized and understood using the language of mental realm. Another formulation says that um, if we suppose that schizophrenia in a person X is realized by a neurophysiological state NX, and a person Y with schizophrenia, there is a neurophysiological state NY responsible for this disorder, then it appears that all the neurophysiological state NX, NY belongs to a distinct class called S, which is the realizer for the condition called schizophrenia. But even from this, we can only show that there is a correlation between the mental states and a type of neurophysiological state. The fact that specific mental phenomena count as mental illness cannot therefore be explained exclusively through brain physiology. A psychological explanation of mental illness is in this regard autonomous in relation to physiological attempts at explanation. So, it is trying to say that even though we can find out neurophysiological states underlying mental disorders, what makes it a dysfunctional brain state is the dysfunctions that is happening in the mental or psychological or behavioral domain of the person. So the class of S, which are um, collection of neurobiological states that are found in people with schizophrenia, is classified as pathological states just because what is manifested in the mental domain of the person is considered um, dysfunctional. So the dysfunctionality in the mental domain have a autonomy of its own. So from this, it seems that the computer analogy could have been employed acceptably if it was made clear that the only comparison between software and mind is that the malfunctions happening in software or mind cannot be explained simply with reference to the realizing system, which is the hardware for software and brain for the mind. But this is not how the proponents of autonomy of mental disorders employs this analogy. It is not very well specified that it is the explanatory autonomy or explanatory irreducibility that they are referring to by the term autonomy. Um, so this way of characterizing autonomy would be objected by someone like Fagerberg. She's not making this objection, but there is a possibility for an objection that the inexplicability of software malfunctions in terms of hardware functions follows from the functional separability between the two. That means we cannot explain software malfunction using in terms of hardware functions because software and hardware have like distinct functions. And if that is the case, the explanatory irreducibility won't hold in the case of mind and brain, because there is no functional separability in the case of mind brain relation. They all mental functions are nothing but brain function. Therefore, we can explanatorily reduce mental functions to brain functions, even if it is not possible now, given that our um, researchers to find the brain correlates of our psychological phenomena is yet a growing field. Maybe in the future we can do that. So in principle, we can reduce functional separability to main mental function to brain function. So that would be an objection to the characterizing autonomy as an epistemic or explanatory notion. However, I think that this argument, this objection conflate two various senses of function. The evolutionary account of function, from which the notion of functional separability or inseparability is drawn, constrain function to the physiological constituents of that process. That is, function, they simply look at what is the physiological process that make it possible to have that particular process. And the irreducibility specifies function in a higher level phenomena than the neurobiological state. But when it comes to the people who say that mental functions are irreducible to brain function, they are not concerned about the physiological constituents. Rather, they consider function as in functionalism. Like, what is the purpose of this particular mental process? And that is the function of that. And this notion of function stresses the difference between the nature of neural circuits and a mental activity like thinking. We can explain a mental activity like thinking using brain terms, like saying that, okay, um, the thinking occurs when neural circuit in this part of brain is activated in this and this way. However, we still keep a distinction between thinking or having an emotion, or um, let's say having anxious thoughts, um, as different from what is happening inside the brain, inside like in between neurons. So that difference is what is being stressed um, when we characterize function in terms of the functional role that a mental event has to perform. So, as a separability can be attributed to function, if functions are understood in this way, then we cannot eradicate the explanatory irreducibility that is tried to put forth by the proponents of AMT that we have seen. So Glacken has made this observation that disorder judgments are intended to identify states that threaten an individual's adaptive functioning. So here the function is not referring to uh, just the physiological process that is happening inside the brain. Since this functioning is always in a particular social context, the judgments inevitably have a social and political dimension. When conditions involve a risk to others, the need of the individual have to be balanced against the needs of society. So, what constitute uh, or what gives the attribute of dysfunction to a particular state is always associated with the social context and what is acceptable and non-acceptable, or what is considered beneficial or harmful to the person in that context. So it is not just something that we can specify at the realm of like neurons or in the uh, brain science terms. However, uh, they can say that they can object this defense of autonomy, saying that the claim mental disorders or brain disorders can still be maintained, admitting the explanatory irreducibility. So, let's suppose that Fagerberg would say, okay, I admit that we cannot explain mental disorders using just the brain physiological terms. We need psychological like terms to explain mental disorder, yet we can in principle say that mental disorders are still brain disorder because mind is brain. So I have to show that why this claim that mental disorders are brain disorder cannot be drawn simply from the notion of functional inseparability that she introduced. So for that, I am asking two questions. What justifies the claim that a mental dysfunction is instantiated in the brain? We have seen that uh, for Fagerberg to constitute a dysfunction, there are two conditions. One is the instantiation condition, where the organ should instantiate that dysfunction, and the second condition was that the organ or the um, process or mechanism should have uh, that function as its naturally selected function. So I grant that the evolutionary structure or the selective selection design of mind and brain does not give mind separate functions, in the sense that it has an evolution of its own. Like certain mechanisms in the brain are selected irrespective of what happens in the brain. So I agree that all mental functions are in a sense brain function. But there is some problem with the instantiation condition, which I am going to discuss in the coming slides. So I asked two questions: what justifies the instantiation condition, and what does it mean to say that a mental dysfunction is instantiated in the brain? So here the instantiation does not simply mean that whatever happens in the mental realm of a person is not happening independently of the brain's functioning. And the same goes for dysfunctional mental process. So if this is what instantiation mean, then it does not mean that the brain correlates of a mental dysfunction is also dysfunctional. It simply states that, as it is the case for any mental event, a dysfunctional mental event also have a brain correlate. But this is not what the instantiation condition as formulated by Fagerberg is standing for. It stands for a much stronger condition that though the dysfunctions are manifested in the mental realm, the item that is dysfunctional or disorder is the brain. So they are presupposing a dysfunctional status to the brain. So I asked the question: does the functional inseparability justifies the stronger instantiation condition, which is the claim that the brain state that is correlated with the mental state is itself dysfunctional? Um, so when we ask the question, what does functional inseparability of mind and brain can actually refute? There are two options. Like, either it shows the impossibility of, or refute the impossibility of mental disorders in the absence of brain disorders, or it refute the impossibility of mental disorders in the absence of a corresponding brain state or a brain change. Simply put, the brain, the realizer state in the brain. So I argue that the notion of functional inseparability at best can only show that mental disorder cannot uh, occur in the absence of some corresponding brain change. Candle has used an example of studies conducted in schizophrenia to explain um, why the mind, all mental changes being realized by brain um, states or brain events does not suffice to say that um, the brain state itself is disordered. So there have been a study which tried to find the risk factors for schizophrenia, and they have found that even though like genetics is a major risk factor for schizophrenia, the expression or the genetic risk fact risk for schizophrenia result from the genes expression in the brain. That means there are particular genes that is making the person at risk of developing schizophrenia. However, this does not like directly cause schizophrenia, but it is mediated through some changes in the brain, or it is causing some changes in the brain that via which the condition schizophrenia arises. But Cantel says that this only implies that the effect of the strongest non-risk factors, which is genetics for schizophrenia, is largely occurs in brain tissue, which is um, simply meaning that even though schizophrenia has a lot of risk factors contributed by genetics, it is mediated through brain tissue. It does not allow us to say that the changes in brain is dysfunctional. Um, but BDM or the brain disease model would not be happy with that claim. They want to show that mental disorders are brain disorders in the metaphysical sense, that mental states are realized by the brain in some form or fashion. Therefore, mental disorders are also realized by the brain, and therefore, they are brain disorders. However, the problem with this is that to say the brain changes associated with a mental disorder is dysfunctional or disorder is to assume that the mental disorders are necessarily uh, a dysfunction in the neural correlate, which is to say that if the instantiation condition is meaning the brain is disordered in the case of mental disorder, then they are presupposing what they are actually were trying to justify. The task was to show that why mental disorders are brain disorder, but at the same time they presumes that mental disorders are brain disorders when they say brain instantiates mental dysfunction. If it is simply the case that brain uh, brain like we can see certain brain changes that is resulting in the dysfunctional mental state, then it does not guarantee that that particular brain state is itself dysfunctional. So even though the computer analogy is flawed, the functional inseparability cannot explain why it is necessary that a mental dysfunction should always arise from brain dysfunction. So my intention here was not to argue that there could be brain pathologies underlying the mental disorder conditions. Rather, my attempt was to show that the notion of functional inseparability itself solely cannot justify the claim that if there is a mental dysfunction, the corresponding brain state which realize the mental state is dysfunctional too. So with that, I am concluding. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very clear and reasoned talk. Now I open the floor for any questions that the audience might have.
Shall I go ahead? Sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, since you are moderating, I will ask the first question.
Sure. I know I could have, but then I thought I shouldn't abuse it too much.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Hi, Ashitha. I mean, thanks for your
Hi.
presentation and loved it. And Just probably I can start with a clarificatory question. I didn't understand the part where you mentioned you were discussing autonomy. You were presenting the definitions of autonomy, right? And how the proponents that you are supporting have discussed the autonomy, and you were
Mhm.
trying to show that you are kind of moving towards a different notion of autonomy or something like that. There was an argument there. I didn't understand one part. Why is that the proponents that you provided their thesis of autonomy, why it is epistemic? I didn't understand. You mentioned that autonomy is epistemic. I didn't
Okay.
understand that clarification. Yeah.
Um, so I characterize this notion of autonomy as an epistemic notion because um, none of these proponents. Okay, let's start with what their metaphysical commitment is. So none of these proponents of AMD are against a physicalist understanding of mind. They are all physicalists. They don't accept that there is a mind that exist independently or as distinct from the physical organ called brain. So they are willing to admit that for every mental event, there should be some corresponding neural correlate which realizes it or which is responsible for the uh, mental event to occur. Um but the reducibility of mental disorders to brain disorder is not accepted by them because for them to to explain a mental disorder we have to use certain psychological uh, concepts or terms or ideas like we cannot explain like for them adequate or uh, a meaningful explanation of a condition like depression would not be possible simply by looking at the um, brain. Like we can see that in depressed person there is a lack of serotonin. We are not even sure of that, but as of now we are using the serotonin hypothesis. Lack of the neurotransmitter is correlated with depression. But why is that a dysfunction? Because the person is having a depressed mood, the person is having psychomotor retardation. He's not able to function normally. That is why the serotonin uh, imbalance is called a dysfunction. So the explanation is necessarily looking at what happens in the psychological domain of the person, and hence it is explanatorily irreducible. Like explanatorily, we cannot understand and explain a mental disorder simply in terms of brain. So there is an autonomy for the what we call the mental domain in the uh, like explanation of disorders. I would like to add that I was not trying to defend this position put forth by the proponents of AMD. Rather, I was trying to say that I agree with Fagerberg in refuting the analogy because software and hardware are not similar in relevant aspects. However, uh, there is a problem with how the proponents use the analogy. If what they wanted to do is to put forth the idea that explanatorily we cannot reduce mental disorders to brain disorders, saying that we cannot talk about a mental disorder just in the brain biology terms, then they could have used the analogy in a different way. Now, the problem with the use is that it gives an impression that they are like they are succumbing to some kind of dualism. That is not the case. None of them are proposing dualism, any kind of dualism, in doing this defense of autonomy. Yeah.
Hmm.
Did I?
So yeah. So actually, it's just to make sure that I've got it right. So you're using autonomy as epistemic because you're trying to say that, like, say, even though there is a metaphysical reducibility in that sense, there is non-epistemic reducibility in that inside. So
Yes.
I got confused because you mentioned explanation. There is no explanation. Explanations can be of various kinds. Explanations can be there at the um, epistemic levels as well, metaphysical level as well. So
Mm.
yeah, so now I'm clear. So basically, you're talking about epistemic non-reducibility in that sense, which yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and I have another question, and probably I can just ask it.
Go for it. Go for it. Yeah. Go for
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Huh. I was also thinking, see, I mean, like you brought out that, like, say, most of these proponents would not, I mean, all the discussants would not deny the fact that, like, say, there is some way the mind supervenes on the brain. I mean, more or less that is kind
Yeah.
of accepted in all circles, I think. Then the difficulty there is that, like, say, I think most of this discussion is working on the weaker direction, or a direction which is weaker in the sense, I'll tell you what is stronger if you just give me 1 minute. Say, for example, the argument seems to be that, like, say, um, uh, let me get this. The weaker thing is that, like, say, not all mental things are brain things. Right? Say not all mental functions, not all mental disorders are brain disorders. But we do agree that the stronger connection correlation here is that all brain states or all brain disorders would result in mental disorders or mental functions. I'm using functions, disorders, and all
Okay.
interchangeably here. See, it cannot be the case that if there is a mental brain disorder and my mental states are fine. It cannot be that case. I'm presuming that I haven't come across any case where, like,
Mm.
say, there is a rapid dysfunction at the brain side, but my mental states are absolutely fine, as if I'm a normal person. I don't see we have cases of
Okay.
that. So, given this, what I was trying to think through was that, like, say, this seems to be all of these people are arguing for the other side. That, like, say, there are
Okay.
certain mental states for which we cannot have clear brain correlates or brain correspondence in that sense. Now, given this, what one thing that I felt is lacking is that, like, can you give me a example of a mental function which is not a brain function?
Mm, let's say
Because I
ability
was
to read, like a
okay, you
word
would call that
recognition. Yeah,
okay, fine.
let's take any cognitive function
So
from
any
that.
cognitive function would be a mental function in
Yeah,
that
yeah.
sense. Okay, so but then the problem is that, like, we have example of, at least for your, as I mean, do you have any case study where there is a mental function or a mental disorder for which there is no brain correlation happening? It is very
Okay, okay.
difficult, no?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I am in no way rejecting that or refuting that there could be a mental disorder without a brain correlate. What I am trying to say is that we do not have enough substantiatory ground or justification to say that the brain correlate that we could find out in the brain of a person with a mental disorder is itself dysfunctional. Simply with the commitment to physicalism or the notion called functional separability. That is the only thing I wanted to uh, convey. So, simply because mind and brain are functionally inseparable, because mind does not have a separate process of functional like setup. It does not mean that whatever realized the dysfunctional mental state is itself dysfunctional.
That is true. I'm
In
trying
other
to think.
words,
Huh.
yeah. In other words, it is a scientific hypothesis which have to be confirmed through empirical studies, not something that we can draw from a metaphysical commitment to physicalism.
That is true. And that is
Yeah.
what I felt is bit, I mean, like, what would supplement your argument here is that, like, say, the problem is that you're working with psychiatry. I mean,
Yeah.
it which in itself occupies such a difficult position in this whole spectrum of
Yes, yes.
sciences because it's not on the neuroscience side or the cognitive side. Not on the cognitive science is different. It's not on the neuroscience side. It's also not psychology, which is completely different. Psychiatry is a very mixed bag in that sense. If you speak to psychiatrists, they occupy both psychologists domain and neuroscience domain. And this is where I was also trying to, the thing is, we need a particular case study that can support your argument. Because if there is always a brain correspondence, then I can understand the functional separatability. But also, I don't know that is a good argument, a strong argument. I'll come to that later, probably when through the iteration of rounds. But I was thinking there is a lack of a particular case study that can support your this one, because all the like say you mentioned depression, schizophrenia, and all of those things, which are also studied at the neuroscience level as well, but also at the psychiatrist level as well.
Yes, yes.
I know psychiatrists give medicines for treating the, let's say, for example, serotonin and all of those imbalances. They give medicine for that as well, but also they say that go for counseling. That is their the soft side. So I don't know any treatment by the practitioners involved treating only the mental functions in that sense.
Sorry, could you repeat?
I'm just
The
saying
last.
the psychiatry practice as such. No psychiatrist will just say you just need counseling. So there is a certain commitment that the psychiatry as a discipline has, that it treats both at both levels. It works at both levels. Now, given this, that is where the I think the ambiguity is, and that is the ambiguity of the discipline, not the ambiguity in your argument. Probably that, but that ambiguity reflects, the disciplinary ambiguity reflects in the argument itself. That the argument cannot situate itself clearly on this side or on that side. So how are you going to navigate that is the question for me.
Okay. So yeah, as you said, like the limitations of scientific study to understand what happens in the brain during like different cognitive functions or during uh, emotions are definitely limiting this kind of a study, because I cannot say that whether in the future we can find a neural correlate for an emotion or a disordered state. However, right now I would try to navigate this issue by pointing out, like as I did just now, the claim, the claim like a very strong claim like mental disorders are brain disorders, um, as of now is justified simply by um, using physicalism, what is provided by physicalism. However, since psychiatry is a medical branch, it has consequences in how we understand mental disorders, how the researches are conducted in the labs, like what kind of researches or studies are being encouraged. So, as you said, in India, it is true that when we go to a psychiatrist, they would prescribe medicines, and at the same time, they would also suggest us to give like undergo therapy, like take psychotherapies. But what happens in US, where all these arguments are coming from, or all the RDoc proposal came from, and all our diagnostic manuals that we Indians also use are coming from. What happens there is they have stopped funding studies which are based on the available categories of disorder. So the problem is that we have two classificatory system for mental disorders. One is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM, and the ICD by WHO. Both these systems are symptom based. So each category of mental disorders will be defined as having these and these symptom. And if a person shows a particular number of symptoms among this person has this disorder. So they have stopped funding for researchers which are using the categories provided by these manuals. Rather, they are taking a different path where they have a set of like constructs or certain cognitive domains or psychological domains like fear, arousal, sleep, and intelligence, like various constructs, and then they try to look at what changes or what neural circuitry in the brain is responsible for that. So this is how things are happening in there. And if they want to emphasize only on the neural circuitry level of explanation for this, then it will eventually lead to a hegemony of pharmaceutical interventions in treating mental disorders. So what I was trying to say is that, okay, then let's leave it to the time when neuroscience actually comes up with explanations for disorders simply in the physiological terms. But as of now, the whole substantiation comes from notions such as mind-brain non-duality, the physicalism or functional inseparability in Fagerberg's term. And that itself is not sufficient to say that the brain state responsible for a mental dysfunction is dysfunctional. So the idea is simple. What makes the brain state dysfunctional is the dysfunctionality of the behavior or psychological like process of the person. If we are not considering that as dysfunctional, then the brain state is not dysfunctional. Let's consider the example of homosexuality. It was a disorder in the DSM manual. Uh, and if Fagerberg is right, then yeah, the behavioral and psychological phenomena that a homosexual person has have a dysfunctional state responsible in his brain, his or her brain. Now we don't anymore classify it as a disorder. It is not a dysfunction at all in the contemporary time. So I can ask what happened to the dysfunctional state that was necessarily associated with this condition. So like what makes that brain state non-dysfunctional now? It is because how we like evaluate the psychological and behavioral aspects of that particular condition is no more classified as dysfunctional, and thus the brain state also gets that privilege of not being dysfunctional. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Ashita. I have a few more questions, but I'll join back the queue. But
Sure.
I want to highlight to that, like, say, one thing is that, like, you mentioned, this is not how it's done in India, but in US it's done differently and all of those things. I think it's a very nice opportunity you have to do philosophy of science which is relevant to the Indian context. This is, I mean, I'm just saying just because the literature of other psychiatric philosophy of psychiatry is coming from the West, you can bring
Mhm.
in a different case study which is pertinent to the Indian context in that sense and see how the science is done that is done in India is very different and do philosophical analysis of it. I'll come back to that point later. Yeah, thanks,
Yeah,
thanks,
thanks
Ashita.
for the
Thank you.
suggestion.
Saransh has a question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. I got a lot of questions in my mind, which is a good indication that it was a very good presentation. So yeah, thank you. I'll just ask two. One is about differentiating between functional separability and emergent phenomena, because from what I understand, an emergent phenomena is like a property of a complex system, a lot of little things producing something that is very hard, if not impossible, to reduce to the smaller little things. So I understand what emergent phenomena is, but how are you? But I guess I did not particularly understand what do you mean by functional separability.
Okay. This notion of functional separability that I have used in this presentation only comes from um, what is the selection history that assigns a particular um, function or process to be performed by an organ or an organ system or anything. So let's first take the software hardware case. So the functional separability between software and hardware is a result of its of how software and hardware are designed and assigned particular functions. So a software engineer would be writing a software program specifying what all are the tasks that the software has to do. And the hardware who makes the computer hardware would be again giving specific functions for the hardware parts, which are not something that the software is supposed to perform. Okay, the power input and output of like power and how that is helping the software to function is not something the software itself is supposed to do. It is only the hardware's function. So there is functional separability. That means software and hardware have distinct set of functions. But in the case of mind and brain, there is no functional separability, because whatever the process through which a particular process or um, effect is selected of to be performed by our mind, whether it be the natural selection process where a particular mental event is selected because it is beneficial for the person to survive and reproduce, or let it be any ontogenic evolutionary process where um, let's say the ability to read selected and it is passed on to generation because it is beneficial to us. And there is, in both the cases, these mental functions are occurring just because the corresponding brain state, or what is the brain state that is making it happen, is selected. There is no function that the mind only has as separable from what the brain does to realize it. So that is why the functional separability is not attained in the case of mind and brain. All mental functions are the functions of brain. Uh, a particular mental state is having like is being selected rather than another mental state is because the brain state that is responsible for this mental state is selected, or that mental neural circuitry is getting stronger. And in that sense, mental functions are inseparable from brain functions. Did I answer your question?
Right. So the question, I guess, was about what is the utility of this new concept of functional separability, as opposed to like
Okay.
emergent phenomena. So like the brain being an emergent phenomena. Sorry, the mind being an
Okay.
emergent phenomena of the brain. And is
Okay.
it you seem to suggest that it is because there is more emphasis on the evolutionary history between
Hmm.
the interaction. Is that it, or is there? So what is the utility of this concept? Is what I'm saying.
Okay, so what they are trying to say is that even though like there are emergent properties, like mind is emerging from brain, it does not give it a separate functional role or separate set of functions that is completely independent of what happens in the brain. So there would be like certain properties that is not um, that cannot be found in the physical constituents, which is responsible for the emergence of mind. It still shows that whatever the functional role the emergent phenomena have, it is because the physical organ called brain is um, functioning or um, is running in a way that that would end up in having that mental function.
Okay. Right.
Hi. If I'm sorry, you still have a follow-up question, or can I ask a question?
No, sure, please go ahead.
Yeah. So I had a Now, thank you very much for the presentation. I was wondering if you have something to say regarding, or rather, I was wondering what you mean by dysfunction. I felt maybe if in your presentation you could say a bit more about how you understand dysfunction, because there are different views which look at um, how dysfunction can be understood. If you can just give a map of it and see where you look at yourself. I'll give you 2 or 3 views. Now, one is there's one extreme view which talks about dysfunction, or is an ascription, as it were, in the sense that there are organisms or entities which function. And then when you say something is dysfunctioning, it's either a normative term or a conventional term that you use to determine how it ought to have been. So in that way, no function is natural. I mean, there's no dysfunction that you can find in an organism as such, it all works naturalistically, and then you say that it's dysfunctioning because it doesn't serve a purpose and so on. So you seem to be working with some kind of evolutionary framework where it's dysfunctional if it doesn't serve some kind of ontogenetic purpose and so on. Now, maybe that can be made a bit more explicit and maybe grounded. I was thinking if you can ground it in more arguments for why you think that ought to be, so that such that it looks like dysfunctions are something that you can identify and not just ascribe because of whatever the theory is. And the second one is, even if it is a natural property of certain organisms or entities, there seems to be a lot of leeway in how a particular mental function is working, such that it could be, it could be fulfilling the larger evolutionary purpose, but then there's so much leeway that it can go any way it can go one way or the other. So anyway, the point I'm trying to make is maybe if you can say a bit more about why or how you ground the idea of dysfunctionality. Yeah, that's all I have to say.
Okay. For the purpose of this presentation, I have only used the natural dysfunction analysis of disorder just because that is the view maintained by the people who argued for autonomy, and that is the only account that the opponent, Harriet Fagerberg, is also considering. However,
Okay.
I would maintain an account of disorder which is more like what Jerome Wakefield has introduced, namely the hybrid account, like harmful dysfunction account of disorder, according to which there should be a dysfunctional state and it also should be harmful to call that condition disorder. And I think that this account is more like appropriate in the case of mental disorders, because as of now we are unaware of the pathophysiology of more like almost all of the disorders, and the evaluation is done or the diagnosis is done just because um the problems in or the psycho-behavioral phenomena that is shown by the people who are said to be having a disorder is somehow incapacitating them, or it is somehow harmful to them, and they're like somehow stopping the person to have a uh, like functional life, functional in the sense that it is pulling them back in a lot of ways in his or her social life. And um, yeah so the harm condition is something that is crucial in classifying or conceptualizing disorders. um
So, I mean, so you're only looking at the domain of, or rather, you're looking at a particular set of mental states which are harmful for the functioning of the individual. And then, I mean, so you're not looking at uh, any other kind of disorder, as it were. You're only looking at this,
um,
yeah.
I didn't get the distinction.
No, no, the distinction, I mean, the point I was trying to make was, so you're only looking at, you are just defining disorders now by saying it is that which harms the proper functioning of the individual, because
Yeah.
there could be some quote unquote disorders which may not necessarily harm them that much or not immediately, or it could still be indeterminate whether it's harming or not, depending upon the horizon that you take for, I mean, the evolutionary horizon you take. Um, so, so you're looking at only a small set of those mental functions, not all kinds of disorders. Is that right?
uh, I'm still not getting the
No,
question.
the question. Okay, I'm just. It's kind of a scope question, as it were, a domain question. So now, if you have uh, when you say disorders, right? Your argument is about disorders and whether it can be, identified with mental dysfunctions also. But from what you just talked about now, the ones that are really harmful, right? But because there can be other kinds of disorders
Hmm.
which may not be, which either may be indeterminate or it will be difficult to determine whether it's harmful or not harmful, and two, may not be that harmful to the individual. So those cases, those kinds of mental disorders
Hmm.
doesn't come within the purview of what your theory is talking about or what your claim is. You're only making a claim about some set of mental disorders, which are quote unquote extreme.
um I I don't think so. I'm just asking this for a clarification. So, by disorder that is not that harmful, like you mean disorders like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder?
I mean, okay, I'm not a biologist or a scientist to say which is one or not, but
Okay.
I'm presuming that there are
Hmm.
some which are not that harmful, or it is it's indeterminate whether it's harmful or not, or it can be that in a larger longitudinal uh, overview, when you look at the evolutionary history. I mean, those could be. I mean, they might turn out to be quote unquote useful for a different reason. Yeah.
Okay. Um,
Do you think? I mean, okay. Anyway, think about it. I mean,
yeah,
I mean, yeah. I was just thinking loudly. So, I mean, you just think about it. Whether you want to kind of restrain it to certain kinds of disorders, or just want to maybe talk about what you mean. So, my only point was whether you want to talk about whether you want to kind of define what you mean by dysfunction, and whether
yeah.
there is a scope issue there, whether dysfunctions or whether yours applies to all kinds of dysfunctions or
Mhm.
only certain kinds of dysfunction. Anyway, think about it, and then we can, talk about it later. Okay.
So,
So I
one
will,
thing I
yeah,
can
sure,
say
sure,
is
sure. Go on,
that
go on.
since like in the context of this debate that I have just now discussed, since they are not referring to like or making clear what the reference of mental dysfunctions are, I think it is not wrong to assume that they are referring to the available categories of disorder that now we have from ICD or DSM. And
what is DSM?
DSM is Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, which is produced by American Psychiatry Association, and it is used like all around the world, almost in all countries, to diagnose
Okay,
disorders.
okay, fine. I mean, at least maybe if you can get a footnote or note about what it is that you're talking about as a disorder, then maybe it can help. People
Yeah,
like me. I mean, I'm coming from it completely from an outside perspective. So just at
yeah,
least to know what you mean by mental disorder and so on and so forth. Is it clinical mental disorder or is it any kind of mental disorder?
mm,
Because I'm completely new to this. So yeah, maybe a note about that. Yeah.
yeah, sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Next, so Varun, you had a question? Yeah.
Actually, I think you preempted my question.
Oh, okay,
Actually,
okay. Sorry.
because I
Uh,
think, Ashita, I think what Krishna is also saying, I mean,
Mm,
is it is not just, I think, at least according to me, just a scope question. I think it has a major implication to your argument, and that is what I was trying to bring up. The thing is, see, the point your argument rests on the point that there are dysfunctions of mental dysfunctions which are not dysfunctions at the brains. Your argument rests on this case. The weakness of this argument is that, like, say, first of all, this kind of functional separability is not only the functional separability of mind and brain. There is a lot of functional separability. Like, say, consider our hand. My hand is made up of neurons, and the functions of neurons is very different from the functions of my fingers.
yes, yes.
Right. So there is functional separability here as well. I don't have to
Mm,
go to mind, brain, and all of those things. So one of the things that will be interesting to bring up for your argument is to show that, like, say, there is a specific kind of separability that is applicable to brain and mind that is not applicable to, like, say, chair and wood per se.
mhm,
Right. I mean, like, we have to be really bring in. I mean, that is where I think you have to do a lot of study of brain sciences and psychology science, psychology, cognitive science, because they are the working at that to say that the functions are very different, the brain functions and the mind functions. So a separatability that is situated in your disciplines is what is required. Merely saying functional separatability will not do enough bite here.
yeah,
Now, even if we take with that, what is interesting, what is the weakness of this dysfunctional separatability, in the sense that there can be dysfunctions at the mind side without having dysfunctions at the brain side? There is a problem there. The weakness is that, like, say, for example, consider your homosexuality example. At one point, it was considered as a mental dysfunction. Now it is not. And of course, there is no dysfunctions at the brain side anymore, which is, of course,
mm,
scientifically established. The question to this constantly progressing sciences is that what currently existing mental disorders will later be chucked out.
mm,
Okay, so there are just dysfunctions at the mind side right now. Also, like, say, look at the mental dysfunctions, like, say, attention disorder. Attention disorder is a it has a social conditions of the present. I mean, like, attention disorder was probably not a disorder 100 years
yeah,
before, when we didn't have. So which means then that, like, say, the what gets categorized as dysfunction, mental dysfunctions, is very different, has a different as various historians would say. I think the word is provenance. Am I correct, Krishna? I think provenance is the origin point. In the sense, you look up the word of provenance and all of those things. Some particular dysfunction being identified, some process being identified as a mental dysfunction has lot of different factors going into it. It's not just certain scientists deciding that, okay, today we will call this, certain psychiatrist or psychologist saying that today we will call this as a dysfunction. There are a lot of factors that go into what get categorized as dysfunction. Now, if the factors are very different from now, and why I'm saying this is because there is a lot more factors apart from the natural factors here. But it is very clear that the evolutionary trend, evolutionary and biology decides the factors, the biological and evolutionary factors for the brain side. What is a dysfunction? So on the brain side, what categorized as a dysfunction is very different from how certain things gets categorized as dysfunction on the mental side. Now, this is a weakness because then since the factors determining what is a dysfunction on both the sides are very different, you cannot say that the dysfunction can exist on one side without the dysfunction on the other side. It is obvious because the factors are very different.
Yeah.
So it's a weakness of the argument then, I think.
So you're trying to say that what determines dysfunctions in the mental domain is different from what is determining dysfunction in the brain or the physical uh, state, and that is not undermining the point that I was trying to put forth, because my argument in a sense was trying to say that mental dysfunction itself is not implying dysfunction in the brain.
That is what you
So to
want to
say
argue
that,
for, right?
yeah.
What I'm saying is that the conclusion itself is very weak. It is I mean, I would say it is very obvious in that sense because the factors are very different. What constitutes as mental dysfunction?
Okay.
So then how would you make it have a
Then would
more
you,
of a bite is the question.
okay. If you're saying that it is a weak claim because the criteria are different for brain and mind, then it would sound as if
it is
okay,
obvious.
I'm
Yeah.
still trying.
Anyways, I mean, just think about it. I just thought of
Yeah.
pointing it out. Okay. Yeah. I'm done. I'm done. Thank you, Ashitha.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, I think it was a very good talk, and I mean, I learned a lot of things actually because I'm also new to this area. So, if you have no more questions, then we can maybe sign out, and I can sign out by saying it was a great talk. Thank you very much. Keep working on it, and yeah, see you again later sometime. Okay. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.